along the Kentucky-Tennessee border, and it's coal country, and you don't ever forget it when you're there. In fact, if I ever needed to remember where I was, all I had to do was walk 50 feet out my door to the railroad tracks and listen for the horn and the screeching down in the train yard, and sure enough, within an hour or so, a train would come lumbering past, either bearing explosives north to the mountain up above my house that was being stripped, or back down south, each car loaded over the brim with coal. So in a given day, about 1 or 2 trains would, come past my house, and on the southbound trip, each one would carry about 12,000 tons of coal. And I sat down a few weeks ago to do some math, and I figured out that in the time that I've lived in Wise County, in a little over a year, about 4.5 million tons of coal have been hauled out of the mountain and past my bedroom window to coal plants across the east. That amount of coal has, that's amounted to about 12 million tons of carbon dioxide, and if you like equivalents, that's about equal to chopping down 515 million trees. So that's a big number, right? And that's this, it's the sort of number that made me want to take my crowbar and sledgehammer and go pound on the tracks. And I know I'd break myself before I bent the rails, but I just was like, I'm so mad in that moment because there's nothing quite like having a coal train in your front yard to make you feel powerless. So, the train, it came often, and often it's a very guttural sound, hits you right in the stomach, and I never quite got used to it. And so it would come at least once in the middle of every night, and it would wake me. And I would lay there in my bed just thinking about where that coal was coming from, and where it was going, and how strange it was that here I was living sort of in the midst of this very dramatic and very physical metaphor. The coal train running with so much speed and momentum that it seemed nothing quite could stop it. So I spent a lot of my first couple of months in Appalachia feeling very frustrated. It's the sort of place where I would tense up every time I saw a bumper sticker that said, "Save a coal miner, shoot a tree hugger." And it's the sort of place where it was very easy to vilify coal operators and executives and imagine them as cruel or ruthless or other than human. Other than human, that's really what I wanted to talk about today, is the way that we as writers and thinkers and activists and organizers in our work for justice still have this tendency to dehumanize the people that we work with or against. There are a lot of ways we could go about this definition of dehumanization, but I want to think first about the miners who died at Upper Big Branch coal mine this past spring, how they had been dehumanized. If they were anything like the coal miners that I now know, they would have admitted that they were prisoners to a system that honored production over safety and work over family. They were cogs in the industry's wheel. They had no other choice for their work. And perhaps to a coal operator like Don Blankenship, Massey Energy Company's CEO, they were seen as other than human. Now, consider Mr. Blankenship, and I'm as much at fault for vilifying the man as anyone else. Like, when I hear his name, it's like this movie reel starts turning in my head, and it's all black and white, and there's this man in a top hat, he's like squinty-eyed, and he's sucking out a cigar, and he's laying out this little creepy laugh, and handlebar mustache and everything. And this is what I think of when I hear his name, or what I thought of for a long time. But now, actually a couple months ago, I visited this family in West Virginia, and they pulled out their middle school yearbook, and they pointed to this photo of this young, smiley, handsome man, and it was him. It was just like mind-boggling to me. I was like, Don Blankenship went to middle school? That explains everything. I just think, I guess at this point in time, I've noticed this about myself, and I've noticed this about also many of my colleagues, how it's very easy in the heat of political advocacy to dehumanize these people that we're working with and against. It's very easy to name and make caricatures out of our enemies, just as it's easy to keep a person behind a computer and call them an activist, or emphasize simply the number of our supporters and use that statistic as a way to demonstrate and, as proof of the size of our movements. These are all ways that through my work I've seen that I and others have dehumanized people. I began to think about this a lot, and I began to think about this in the context of the civil rights movement. And in fact, the civil rights movement was entirely centered around this concept of rehumanization, right? You know, if you revisit the most influential speeches by leaders in that movement, you notice that they're never about passing a particular piece of legislation. They're about a shift in consciousness in which white and black people begin to see one another as equals. And you know, I think we reflect so much on the civil rights movement because we see it as a very successful movement. But in fact, those real successes that those leaders were striving for, this shift in consciousness, is still very much in the process of emerging. So I think that those leaders really understood the key to real change. I think they understood, you know, the stuff that builds real movements, slow movements. I think they understood that at the center of our work, you know, is making ourselves human again. So, you know, then the question is, well, how do we make ourselves human? And, you know, that can be a broadly interpreted phrase. But I guess for the purposes of this speech, I'll just say, well, one first step is that, you know, we rehumanize our enemies. And this is by no means a new idea. It's biblical. It traces back to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus standing over the Sea of Galilee saying, love your neighbors. And, you know, it's been used time and time again by philosophers like Martin Buber, who talked about real human dialogue, the I and thou, and by visionaries like Martin Luther King, of course. And at some point this summer, I decided that it was about time for me to love my enemy too. So I picked up the phone, and I called this guy named Jim LaForce. And now, Mr. LaForce, he's a coal executive for the same company that strips the mountain up above my house. And I had met Mr. LaForce a couple months back at a legislative hearing, and it was at a time where I had sort of burned out on activism, and I decided I was going to try to be a writer instead. So I was interviewing Mr. LaForce, and he was telling me about the process of reclamation, how a coal company will put a mountain back after they've blasted off the bedrock and scraped out the coal, and they spray it with this fluorescent green hydro seed, and within a month or so, the rest of that mountain sprouts into this grassy field. And you could tell I was very skeptical, and so he actually invited me down to his office in Wise County the next time I was there, and he told me he would show me his operations. So a few weeks later, I was down in his office and climbing into his company car, and we started out at a place I had been to often, CVS Pharmacy Plaza, and behind it the hospital and medical center. And the land on which the plaza sits was actually stripped back in the 70s when strip mining first came to Wise County, Virginia. And so it's still flat, of course, and it's treeless, and actually many of the businesses that were once there are now boarded up. But according to Mr. LaForce, none of that would be there if his company hadn't made the land flat. He said, look, you know, we can't just tell a company that if you come, we'll take that mountain down. We have to take that mountain down first, and then they'll come. And so we drove next. We drove down that hill and through the town of Norton. And Norton is like a lot of Appalachians towns, you know, nice old brick buildings, aging very ungracefully since the coal boom subsided, and a few businesses here and there that have occupied a niche that Walmart couldn't fill. And at that point, he started to tell me about environmentalists, you know, the problem with environmentalists like myself, and it was that we just didn't understand coal as a source of progress. So I asked him, well, all right, well, what do you mean by progress? What does progress mean? And we were just cresting this hill, overlooking this wide, vast stripped valley, and there was a Lowe's, and there was a McDonald's, and a Kmart, and he was like, look, this is progress. And I didn't really say much. I just listened to Mr. LaForce. We kept on driving. We went up to the mountain up above my house, and he showed me the operation, these sort of sloughing and terraced mountainsides, and in the distance, these mesa-like cliffs where the company was still stripping. And at that point, you know, I asked him, well, do you think that coal is going to run out? And he said, oh, yeah, it will run out, at least within like 20 years in Wise County. And I was like, well, so, you know, should we be transitioning, or what should we, why are we doing this? And he said, well, yeah, I mean, if you have a car and you know it'll last you 10 years, you're not going to junk it, you'll just drive it until it's through. And so our conversation went on like this, me just asking a few questions, mainly just listening, and finally he dropped me back off at his office. And he shook my hand, and he looked at me and he said, "Just please don't write anything that will make me lose my job." And then he walked inside. And it was really the most human thing he could have done, to walk away knowing that I had disagreed with nearly every word he had said, but also knowing that I wouldn't do him wrong. You know, I couldn't vilify him, no matter how much I disagreed with his arguments or his way of doing business. At that point in time, he was just a man with a family, you know, lucky to have had a job that had lasted his whole career. His work had been good to him, coal had been good to him, and he honestly believed that what he was doing was honorable and good. I guess, you know, at that point, I'm telling this story because on that day, I reached this very important level of understanding that I could not have reached, you know, in any other way. I could not have reached that level of understanding if I was not in that car with Mr. LaForce, hearing his words and seeing his eyes at the same time. Which brings me to my second idea of, you know, how do we begin to make ourselves human again? And I think this one is actually a more difficult one, particularly for myself and many people in this room, you know, all of us having grown up in the information age. And that's, we need to be very wary of social media. You know, I guess I know that the most important conversations cannot be had over Twitter, and the most important relationships cannot be built over Facebook, and the most pivotal acts of civil disobedience do not come about when, you know, an attendee first shows his or her support by clicking a button that says, "Yes, I'll be there." Social media has become a really, really important tool, but I think if relied on too heavily, it can also be very dangerous. And I've seen this happen in my own work. It can be dangerous, I think, because it can trick us into believing that things can happen quickly. But real change, you know, the kind of change that I think we're all striving for, does not happen quickly. And when we think something's about to happen, I've seen that we begin to also act quickly. We say that I'm only going to do this job for 1 year, and I'm going to work really hard at it, because I know the harder I work, the more likely it will be that we win. And when we win, then I'll take a break. You know, that's how I burned out. That's how a lot of my friends burned out, many of whom, you know, took 120 hours a week working for their Obama campaign, you know, took time off of life in general or school to do that. And they worked harder than they've ever worked. And when the president was elected, you know, when the real work had just begun, they were too tired, or they had to go back to school, or they went to work on farms. They found the kind of work that rejuvenated them. I'll use my own experience as an example. You know, when I, 2 years ago, I moved to West Virginia, and because I became the national coordinator for a project called Power Pass Coal. Many thanks to a professor here, John at the college. And this project was a collaboration between Appalachian groups and indigenous communities and Powder River Basin ranchers and a lot of people around the country who are being unjustly impacted by coal. And together we came up with this idea for the 100 days of action. So for the first 100 days of Obama's administration, one community would take action in some way, and then the next day another community would take action. And then by the end of this 100 days, we would have this momentous effect, and we would see that there was a national movement of people who were all working on this transition away from coal. And a lot of people in this room were involved in this project, and it was really cool to watch come to life. But for me, honestly, it wasn't very satisfying, because throughout, you know, this whole process, I was simply behind my computer. I was managing the web page. I was updating Facebook and Twitter. I was taking phone calls, writing blogs and press releases. I was raising thousands of dollars from people I had never met in person. And, you know, so that wasn't very satisfying, but there was this one particular moment at the end that was very satisfying, and it came in the last day. And I was in Washington, D.C. with 6 coalfield delegates from around the country. And we had a meeting at the EPA with the climate advisor, Bob Sussman. So we went in and we all sat around this big oak table. And we each introduced ourselves And Mr. Sussman asked each of the coalfield delegates there to explain why they were there that day. And one older woman spoke about how her husband had died of black lung. And a rancher told of how his fields had dried up after coal, which is a natural aquifer, was stripped off of the neighboring land. And another young man spoke about how his community had developed respiratory problems after 2 coal-fired power plants had moved into the neighborhood. And after everyone had spoken, Mr. Sussman thanked each person, and then he said, "These were the stories that I needed to hear." And again, it was a very human moment. You know, no one averted his or her eyes, no one rushed to leave the room. Everything that was said and expressed was true. It was the sort of moment that made me think, this is it, you know, this is the key to real change. But then I left and I realized that it wasn't as easy as putting 2 people in the same room together. Those people had to come into that room willing to simply understand the other side and hear that story. You know, I have to be able to climb into Mr. LaForce's car with really no agenda, knowing that I'm there just to listen, and knowing that if he does ask me a question, that I can answer with so much truth and honesty with a story that he has no reason at that moment to argue against me. You know, a lot of my friends and colleagues have been stepping back right now to sort of rethink what it is we're trying to do. You know, why is it that we want to stop coal? Why is it that we need to stop climate change? And you know, is it about trying to remake our nation's economy with clean energy? Is it about stopping these individual coal plants, having these individual victories? And then, you know, we think, well, no, those are all important steps along the way, but this is really about, you know, we don't want our world to die, right? It's about justice. It's about access to a healthy and productive life. So I guess at this point, I've been thinking a lot about how this is about justice, how this is about this access. And I think that, you know, at some point in time, I was thinking about this in my work in the coalfields and sort of how this connects to my own how I burned out and how my friends have burned out, and you know, how are we actually going to make this real change that we want to happen? I turned at one point to this poem by Middlebury, and you know, I've begun to treat it like doctrine in my work in the coalfields, and it goes like this. You know, I'm running late, but it says, "Communicate slowly, live a 3-dimensional life. Stay away from screens. Stay away from anything that obscures the place it is in. There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places." These sacred places I found are where I leave room for silence in the middle of a conversation, and where the person I'm talking to can fill in with the answer to a question that I've never asked. You know, these sacred places I found while I was standing with a woman beneath the spindly skeleton of her house, and it was right after a flash flood had swept through her hollow and gutted out everything that she owned. And her husband had worked at that strip mine up above her hollow that had caused that flood. And coal had given them everything, every material thing they owned over the course of their 80 years. And in 15 minutes, it just swept it all away. And then, again, just last week, I was in DC, and this very sacred thing happened where I was watching the first Appalachian woman I had met get arrested at the gates of the White House. And she had told me that morning that she was going to do it. And it surprised me. But then later, when I saw the police taking her away in handcuffs, I just started to well up because it just made so much sense to me. You know, it made so much sense to me because I knew her story. And because when she was young, her family's home place had been swept away when a sludge pond broke. And so it wasn't her arrest that made me well up, it was everything that had come before it. You know, all 60 years of her story packed behind this one symbolic event. And I wondered if other people around me understood the gravity of this, and I really wish that they did. But these are the sacred places, the human places that I'm talking about. These are the places where everything said and done is true, where the story is more important than the action. And these are the places where I've learned my patience, and where I know that real change does not happen fast. This is going to take a long time, and I know that, and I don't want to tire myself out again. So whatever I do next is going to be a little more deliberate and a little slower